Sometimes the strongest battles are not fought on battlefields, but in the quiet fight to hold on to your dignity. In the shattered streets of occupied France, 1942, a young French nurse named Lucie Moreau moved carefully through the ruins. Carrying more than just medical supplies, she carried the hopes of her people. Her white uniform, stained with dust and fear, stood like a fragile light against the ruins. Every step was a promise to help, a silent act of defiance. Until one day, that hope was tested beyond words. A day when honor itself was broken, not by the roar of war, but by the cruelty of those who had forgotten their own humanity. Today we bring you a story of courage, heartbreak, and the quiet strength that refuses to die even in the darkest of times. Welcome to the channel. If you believe these stories should never be forgotten, join us. Subscribe now and turn on the notifications to help keep every memory and every story alive. Without further delay, let's get straight to the point. The weight of silence can sometimes be heavier than any weapon. In the broken heart of occupied France, 1942, a story unfolded that would leave invisible marks on everyone who witnessed it, and on one young woman who refused to be forgotten. Lucie Moreau, a volunteer nurse from a small French village, had spent her days moving through streets filled with dust and sorrow, offering what little comfort she could to a people stripped of their freedom. She wore her white uniform like a fragile shield, stained with the dirt of a country crushed under foreign boots. But even the purest intentions can't always protect you from cruelty. One grey afternoon, in the center of a ruined square, Lucie was stopped by two German soldiers, Sergeant Hans Weber, whose laughter carried a sharp edge, and Corporal Kurt Adler, who stood silent, his eyes heavy with something close to shame. They claimed it was just a security inspection, but their actions told a different story. Before a small crowd of villagers and young soldiers, Hans mocked her, tearing open her medical bag and scattering her supplies across the ground like they meant nothing. Kurt shifted uncomfortably, refusing to meet her eyes, but he said nothing. None of them said anything. Among the silent watchers stood Matthias Gruber, an Austrian conscript barely older than a boy. His heart battled inside him, duty on one side and something deeper and more human on the other. His fists clenched tightly in the pockets of his uniform, but he stayed frozen, trapped between orders and the quiet scream inside his chest. Lucie gathered her things with trembling hands, her face burning with humiliation. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but in that moment, all she could do was run. She fled through the ruined streets, her footsteps echoing against broken stones, carrying not just her supplies, but the crushing weight of betrayal, loneliness, and rage. That night, back in the tiny room where she lived, above a deserted bakery, Lucie stared into a broken shard of mirror. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her, a woman whose dignity had been bruised not by violence, but by the cold indifference of those who had chosen to look away. Tears blurred her vision, but her spirit remained unbroken. She made a silent vow, tracing her reflection with trembling fingers. This would not end in silence. Her story and the quiet resistance of every soul who endured without surrendering their humanity would live on, even if the world tried to forget. And somewhere, deep inside Matthias Gruber, something shifted. He had seen her pain. He had heard the weight of her silence louder than any shout. In the days that followed, Matthias would face his own crossroads, a moment where he would have to choose between the orders barked at him and the quiet voice of conscience that Lucie had awakened. For now, the village remained still, but beneath the silence, new roots of quiet defiance began to grow, roots that even the harshest boots could not stamp out. Back in the hidden shelter where the few remaining volunteers gathered, Lucie Moreau sat at a worn wooden table, her hands trembling as she gripped a pen. The events of the day weighed heavily on her heart, but something even stronger was growing inside her, a determination that would not be broken. With slow, careful strokes, she began to write. Every word carried the weight of what she had lived through. She wrote down every detail, not just to remember, but to fight back in the only way she could. Her hand shook, but her spirit only grew steadier with every line. As she wrote, Lucie thought of her brother, Moreau, who had given everything months earlier during the fierce battles in Spain. His courage lived in her, breathing strength into every word. She whispered a quiet promise to him, that she would not be silenced, and that the fight for dignity and freedom would not end with her shame. When the first light of dawn touched the broken rooftops, Lucie finished her letter. It was not just a message, it was a seed of quiet rebellion. The letter was meant for Elena Schmidt, a German nurse who, despite the risks, had secretly chosen to stand with the French resistance. Through the carefully written words, Lucie reached across the walls that divided them, planting the first roots of her own battle. A battle not fought with weapons, but with truth, courage, and the unwavering belief that even in the darkest times, humanity could still rise. The ink had barely dried when Lucie folded the letter, tucking it carefully into a hidden pocket. Her hands were no longer trembling. The fear was still there, of course. How could it not be? But now it was joined by something far stronger. Hope. Hope that her voice, carried quietly through secret hands and shadowed paths, could one day break the silence that so many had been forced to accept. In that moment, in a forgotten corner of a crumbling village, Lucie Moreau became something more than a nurse. She became a bearer of memory, of resistance, and of all the quiet, unstoppable forces that history would one day remember. In the quiet, fragile web of the resistance, hope often traveled in whispers. When Lucie Moreau's secret letter finally reached Elena Schmidt, the answer came faster than she dared to dream. Hidden between the folds of a worn scrap of fabric, Elena's reply carried just a few simple words. "You are not alone, sister." It was more than a message. It was a lifeline. Elena, risking everything she had, became the bridge Lucie needed to step deeper into the shadows of the resistance. Through Elena's careful connections, Lucie was introduced to Captain Arthur Collins, a British officer working with the Special Operations Executive, the SOE, an organization built to fight from the inside, in places where the world had gone silent. Captain Collins had seen more than his share of sorrow. After losing his entire unit during the desperate retreat at Dunkirk, he carried his own scars, invisible to the eye, but heavy on the soul. When he met Lucie, he saw something in her that mirrored his own spirit, a quiet strength, a will to stand firm, even when everything else had fallen apart. They didn't speak of grand victories or quick revenge. They spoke of truth, of gathering proof, of fighting not just against one cruel man, but against a system built on fear, silence, and impunity. Together, they began to weave a plan, careful, patient, dangerous, to expose Hans Weber and those like him for what they truly were. In a world where every step could be their last, trust was rare. But between Lucie, Elena, and Captain Collins, a fragile alliance was born, a spark of light hidden deep in enemy territory, waiting for its moment to burn bright. Through secret meetings and whispered promises, Lucie Moreau's small circle began to grow. With the quiet support of Captain Arthur Collins and Elena Schmidt, Lucie found others whose lives had been scarred by cruelty, women whose stories had been buried beneath fear and shame. There was Marie Dubois, a strong widow whose husband had been taken and executed under false charges. Her eyes carried the heavy sadness of loss, but her voice, though quiet, spoke with the weight of truth. And there was Sofia Vasili, a young Polish girl, barely more than a child, who had suffered unthinkable cruelty in a labor camp far from her home. Sophia's hands trembled when she spoke, but in her heart a fierce courage had been born. Every story Lucie heard added a new weight to her spirit, a sorrow so heavy it sometimes seemed impossible to carry. Yet with every tear shed behind closed doors, her purpose only burned brighter. The pain did not break them, it shaped them. Forged in silence and suffering, their will became stronger than fear itself. They all knew what they were up against. To accuse a sergeant of the Wehrmacht was not a small act. Of rebellion, it was a death sentence if they were discovered, but they also knew something even deeper. Silence was the true betrayal. Turning away, pretending not to see, would be a wound they could never heal. Together, they decided to risk everything, not for revenge, not for anger, but for dignity, for every soul who had been made to feel invisible, for the hope that someday truth would matter more than power. In the ruins of a world that had lost its way, Lucie and her newfound allies lit a small, stubborn flame, a promise that even when voices are broken, the will to stand and fight for what is right can still rise from the ashes. Far from the quiet meetings of the resistance, another battle was taking place. One fought deep inside a man who had long been taught to stay silent. Corporal Kurt Adler carried the heavy burden of what he had seen. Night after night, alone in the darkness of the barracks, memories clawed at him. The broken look in Lucie Moreau's eyes, the laughter of Sergeant Hans Weber, and the crushing silence of those who had turned away. But there was one memory that haunted him even more. The face of his brother, lost on the frozen fields of Stalingrad. A brother who had once told him that true strength was not measured by cruelty, but by the ability to protect those who could not fight for themselves. The weight of those words grew heavier with each passing day. Kurt knew he could not erase what had happened. He could not undo the shame of standing by in silence. But maybe, just maybe, he could still choose the kind of man he wanted to be. One cold evening, under the crumbling remains of a bombed-out church, Kurt found the courage to act. His hands shook as he stepped into the shadows where Captain Arthur Collins was waiting. The air smelled of damp stone and old smoke. Kurt's voice, barely more than a whisper, broke the silence. "I want to help. I can't stay silent anymore." With trembling fingers, he passed a bundle of documents into Arthur's hands. Internal reports, forgotten testimonies, evidence that could expose Hans Weber's abuses. Kurt knew exactly what he was risking. He wasn't just defying a man. He was standing against an entire system built on fear, control, and silence. And he understood the cost. But in that dark, broken place, he made his choice. It was better to risk everything with honor than to live another day as a willing accomplice. For the first time in months, Kurt felt a flicker of peace inside his chest. The first breath of a man who had been lost but had finally found his way again. The storm was closer than they realized. Working in the shadows, Lucie Moreau and Captain Arthur Collins moved swiftly. Using forged papers and improvised disguises, they gathered every piece of evidence they had managed to collect. Elena Schmidt, careful and brilliant, disguised the sensitive documents by encoding them into harmless-looking letters. Each message was sent by carrier pigeons, their fragile wings carrying the weight of a secret war across the sky, all the way to the SOE headquarters in London. For a brief moment, hope flickered. Maybe they had moved fast enough. Maybe they had stayed invisible. But evil has a way of sensing when its grip is slipping. Hans Weber, sharp and suspicious, began to notice the small cracks forming in his perfect control. And when fear grows in the hearts of men like him, it often turns into blind fury. One cold, rainy night, he struck. Storming into the small volunteer shelter, boots thundering against the old wooden floors, Hans tore the fragile piece apart. The volunteers scrambled, caught off guard. But Lucie did not move. She stood firm in the middle of the chaos, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her gaze steady as steel. Face to face with the man who had tried to break her spirit, Lucie held her ground. The rain battered the broken windows. The thunder shook the walls. But inside her, there was only silence. A calm stronger than any fear. Hans sneered, thinking he could crush what little hope remained, but Lucie, her voice clear and unwavering, met his hatred head-on. "You can destroy me," she said, her words cutting through the storm, "but you will never destroy the truth." The room seemed to freeze. In that moment, Lucie Moreau was not just a nurse, not just a girl from a forgotten village. She was the voice of every soul that cruelty had tried to silence, and she would not back down. No matter what came next. In the hidden veins of occupied France, far from the eyes of those who ruled with iron fists, a quiet storm was gathering. Deep beneath the hills of Lyon, in a cold, dimly lit room carved into the earth, the French resistance held a secret tribunal. There were no grand banners, no polished uniforms, only worn faces, heavy hearts, and a shared promise that justice, however fragile, would have its day. Lucie Moreau stood at the center of the small gathering, her hands steady, her voice clear. In that underground room, she was not a victim. She was a witness, a soul who had refused to be silenced. Every word she spoke carried not just her own pain, but the sorrow and courage of so many others whose voices had been lost to fear. Around her, the faces of the resistance listened in solemn silence. No one interrupted, no one turned away. Then Matthias Gruber stepped forward. Gone was the boy who had once been paralyzed by duty and fear. In his place stood a man who had chosen to reclaim his own honor, no matter the cost. His testimony, simple and raw, shook the walls more than any explosion could have. And then came Corporal Kurt Adler. With trembling hands, he laid the documents on the worn wooden table, the reports, the hidden truths, the evidence they had risked their lives to save. Each paper, each signature was a crack in the towering walls of impunity that Hans Weber had once thought invincible. As the voices rose one by one, telling the truth without fear, it was as if centuries of oppression were being exhaled from that room, and for the first time, the air tasted like hope. They knew this small act of justice might never be written in history books. They knew the risks that waited outside those walls. But in that moment, beneath the battered hills of Lyon, they reclaimed something that no army could ever take from them: their dignity, their voice, and the dream of a future built on truth rather than terror. Justice, when it finally came, did not bring celebration. After a tense and solemn tribunal, Hans Weber was found guilty. There were no shouts, no triumph, only a silence so heavy it seemed to sink into the very ground beneath their feet. He was taken to a hidden resistance camp where his fate was sealed, not out of hatred, but as a grim answer to the cruelty he had chosen to wield. Lucie Moreau watched it all unfold with hollow eyes. She did not smile. She did not cheer. As the grey sky stretched endlessly above her, Lucie felt only a deep aching sorrow, not for Hans, but for everything the war had stolen, for the dreams shattered, the families broken, and the innocence lost somewhere between the ashes and the smoke. The world would not be made whole again by one act of justice. It would take years, maybe lifetimes, to heal wounds cut so deep. But as Lucie stood there, tears tracing silent paths down her cheeks, she realized she was no longer alone. Around her, the faces of those who had chosen to fight not with hatred, but with courage, stood close. Eleanor, with her quiet, unbreakable resolve. Arthur, carrying the weight of his own past, but choosing to build something better. Kurt, who had found his voice when it mattered most. And Matthias, once broken by fear, now whole in his choice to stand for what was right. In the ruins left behind by a world at war, Lucie had found something precious. A new family, forged not by blood, but by the fires of loss, hope, and the promise to never again let silence reign. They were the survivors, the witnesses, the keepers of memories that the world would one day need to remember. When the war finally loosened its grip on the world, Lucie Moreau returned to her homeland in France. She carried no riches, no medals, only a handful of letters written by candlelight and memories that time could never erase. In her heart, she carried the voices of those who had stood beside her, those who had chosen dignity over fear. Lucie's courage became a quiet spark, inspiring many others, victims who had once been too afraid to speak, to rise and seek justice for themselves. Because of her, the silence was broken. Far away, Kurt Adler, once branded a traitor by the system he had once served, found a new life in England, welcomed by Captain Arthur Collins as a brother. Matthias Gruber returned to his family's farm to rebuild the life that war had tried to steal from him. And Elena Schmidt, steadfast and unshaken, dedicated herself to saving lives in refugee camps where hope was needed most. Each of them carried scars, invisible but real. Each of them carried memories that would never truly fade, but they also carried something stronger, the proof that even in the darkest times, even under the weight of cruelty and sorrow, a single act of courage could light a path forward. Lucie knew the pain would never fully disappear. Some wounds do not close, some memories stay etched in the soul. But she also knew something deeper, that true victory was never about survival alone. It was about holding onto your soul when the world tried to tear it away. As she stood one evening beneath a sky full of stars, a sky she had once feared she would never see again, Lucie understood the legacy they had built together. Not a legacy of power or conquest, but one of honor, memory, and hope. Even in the deepest shadows, light can survive. And sometimes that light is carried not by heroes in grand stories, but by ordinary souls who refuse to let fear win. Did you already know this story? What would you have done if you were in Lucie's place? What other stories of soldiers and silent heroes should be told? Share your thoughts with us in the comments. Your voice helps keep their memory alive. If this story moved you, don't let it be forgotten. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to hear more stories like this one. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Stay strong, stay hopeful, and until next time, remember, some battles are fought with more than weapons. They are fought and won with the heart.